When Marcus opened his door that stormy night, the soaked girl standing there looked desperate. He never imagined this one act of kindness would expose secrets that would change his daughter's life forever and force a billionaire to his knees. Like, comment, and subscribe, so we can keep sharing stories like this. The rain hammered against the small house like thousands of angry fists demanding entry. Marcus Williams wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, exhausted after his double shift at the Riverside manufacturing plant. His muscles ached with the kind of deep fatigue that comes from lifting heavy machinery parts for 16 hours straight, but he couldn't afford to rest. Not when there were bills piling up on the kitchen counter like silent accusations of his failures. "Daddy!" 7-year-old Emma's voice called from the tiny bedroom they shared in the two-room house. "The ceiling is leaking again." Marcus grabbed the plastic bucket they kept specifically for this recurring disaster and rushed to place it under the steady drip coming from the corner of the ceiling. The rhythmic plink, plink, plink of water hitting plastic was a sound that haunted his dreams, a constant reminder that he couldn't even afford to fix the roof over his daughter's head. "It's okay, sweetheart," Marcus said, forcing a smile that he knew didn't reach his eyes. "The bucket will catch it. Why don't you come to the kitchen? I managed to get us some chicken from Mrs. Patterson's diner. She said it was left over from lunch service." Emma looked up at him with those big eyes that were so much like her mother's, and Marcus felt the familiar ache in his chest. 3 years had passed since Sarah died in the accident. 3 years of struggling alone to be both mother and father to their daughter. 3 years of barely keeping their heads above water. The truth was that the chicken wasn't left over at all. Mrs. Patterson had seen Marcus counting coins at the diner that morning, had seen the desperation in his eyes, and had quietly wrapped up a full meal, refusing to take his money. It was charity disguised as leftovers, and Marcus hated accepting it, but his pride couldn't stand between his daughter and a proper meal. They were halfway through dinner when the knocking started. Not the polite tap of a neighbor, but desperate pounding that made the thin door shake in its frame. Marcus froze, his fork suspended in mid-air. Nobody came to their house at this hour, especially not in weather like this. The neighborhood they lived in wasn't exactly dangerous, but it wasn't safe either. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business because getting involved usually meant trouble. The knocking came again, more urgent this time, accompanied by a voice that was barely audible over the storm. "Please, please, I need help." "Stay here," Marcus told Emma, rising slowly from the table. His heart pounded as he approached the door. Every instinct told him not to open it, to pretend they weren't home, to protect his daughter from whatever chaos stood on the other side. But that voice, there was something in it that reminded him of Sarah's last moments, that same desperate plea for help that he'd been unable to answer when it mattered most. Marcus opened the door. Standing on his doorstep was a young woman, completely drenched from the storm. Her hair hung in wet strands around her face, and she was shivering so violently that Marcus could see it even in the dim light from his kitchen. She looked to be in her early 20s, and there was something about her appearance that seemed completely out of place in this neighborhood, though Marcus couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. "Please," she gasped, her teeth chattering. "My car broke down about a mile from here. My phone is dead. I've been walking for hours and I just need to get dry and call someone, please." Marcus should have said no. Every rational thought in his head screamed at him to close the door, to protect his daughter, to avoid whatever complications this stranger would inevitably bring. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw genuine fear mixed with exhaustion, and he found himself stepping aside. "Come in," he said quietly, "but just for a moment until you can call someone." The young woman practically stumbled into the house, leaving puddles on the worn linoleum floor. Emma peeked out from the kitchen, her eyes wide with curiosity and caution. "Thank you," the stranger said, her voice breaking with relief. "Thank you so much. I'm Sophie." "Marcus," he responded, grabbing the only towel they had that wasn't already threadbare. "This is my daughter, Emma. You can dry off and use my phone to call someone." Sophie took the towel with hands that were still trembling. As she began to dry her face and hair, Marcus noticed things that made his suspicion grow. The quality of her clothing, despite being soaked, was expensive. The kind of expensive that people in his neighborhood never wore unless they were trying to get robbed. Her hands were smooth, uncalloused, the hands of someone who'd never done a day of manual labor in her life. "What were you doing driving through this neighborhood?" Marcus asked, his tone more defensive than he intended. "This isn't exactly on the way to anywhere nice." Sophie hesitated, and in that hesitation, Marcus saw something that looked like shame mixed with fear. "I was running away from something. Someone. I just started driving and got lost. When my car died, I didn't know what to do." It was a vague answer, the kind that raised more questions than it answered. But before Marcus could press further, Emma appeared at his elbow. "Daddy, she's cold," Emma said with the simple compassion of childhood. "Can she have some chicken? We have extra." Marcus wanted to say no. The extra chicken was supposed to be his lunch for tomorrow, his only meal during his next shift. But Emma was looking at him with such hopeful innocence, and Sophie's eyes held such gratitude, that he found himself nodding. "Sit down," he said gruffly, pulling out a chair at their tiny kitchen table. "Emma's right. You need to eat something." As Sophie sat down, Marcus couldn't help but notice how out of place she looked in their humble kitchen. The table was scarred and wobbly, the chairs mismatched, the walls stained with water damage. Everything in their home screamed poverty, and he felt a flush of shame creeping up his neck. "I really appreciate this," Sophie said softly, accepting the plate Marcus offered her. "You have no idea what this means to me." "It's just chicken," Marcus replied, his voice rough with discomfort. He handed her his old cell phone, the kind with actual buttons that he'd bought used years ago. "Call whoever you need to call." Sophie stared at the phone for a long moment, and Marcus saw something flicker across her face. Uncertainty, fear, he couldn't tell. Finally, she dialed a number, but whoever answered must have gone straight to voicemail, because she quickly ended the call. "No answer," she said quietly. Could I possibly stay just until morning? I promise I'll leave first thing. I just can't go back out in that storm." Every logical part of Marcus's brain screamed that this was a terrible idea. They didn't know this woman. She could be dangerous. She could be running from the law. She could bring trouble that his daughter didn't need. But then he looked at Emma, who was watching Sophie with open curiosity and concern, and he thought about what he wanted to teach his daughter. Did he want to teach her to turn away from people in need? Did he want her to learn that survival meant closing your heart to others? "You can sleep on the couch," Marcus said finally. "But first thing in the morning, you need to leave." Relief washed over Sophie's face so intensely that Marcus wondered what she was really running from. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me. I promise I won't be any trouble." As the night wore on, Marcus set Sophie up on their threadbare couch with the blanket that usually covered the hole in the cushion. Emma had already fallen asleep, exhausted from the excitement of having a visitor. "Your daughter is beautiful," Sophie said softly, watching Emma's sleeping form through the bedroom doorway. "She's lucky to have a father like you." "I'm the lucky one," Marcus replied automatically, though the words felt hollow. How could he be lucky when he could barely provide for his child? When every month was a struggle to pay rent and put food on the table? When he had to accept charity disguised as kindness just to feed his daughter? "You're a good man, Marcus," Sophie said, and there was something in her voice that made him turn to look at her. She was watching him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Not many people would have opened that door tonight. "Yeah, well, not many people are stupid enough to let strangers into their house," Marcus replied, trying to lighten the mood but failing. As he lay in the darkness later that night, Emma breathing softly beside him and the stranger sleeping in their living room, Marcus wondered what he'd just brought into their lives. He had no idea that this single act of kindness was about to unravel secrets that would change everything he thought he knew about mercy, judgment, and the vast distance between worlds that existed in the same city.
He had no idea that the soaked girl on his doorstep was Sophie Hartwell, the runaway daughter of billionaire real estate mogul Richard Hartwell, whose face had been plastered across every news channel in the state for the past week.
And he had absolutely no idea that by morning, his simple act of compassion would set in motion events that would either save his family or destroy everything he'd worked so hard to protect. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small house, 3 people slept uneasily, each carrying secrets and fears that would soon collide in ways none of them could predict. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would test Marcus's character in ways he'd never imagined, expose Sophie's desperate truth, and ultimately prove that sometimes the poorest among us are richest in the things that truly matter. But tonight, there was only the sound of rain, the steady drip into the bucket, and the fragile peace of strangers finding temporary shelter in each other's humanity. Marcus woke to the smell of coffee, which was impossible because he'd run out of coffee 3 days ago and couldn't afford to buy more until his next paycheck. For a disoriented moment, he thought he was dreaming, or that somehow Sarah had come back and was making breakfast like she used to on Sunday mornings. Then reality crashed back. The stranger, Sophie. He'd let a complete stranger stay in his house overnight. Marcus bolted upright, immediately checking that Emma was still sleeping peacefully beside him. Relief flooded through him when he saw his daughter's chest rising and falling steadily. Whatever else happened, at least she was safe. He crept out of the bedroom and stopped dead in the doorway to the kitchen. Sophie was standing at his ancient stove, somehow managing to cook something that smelled incredible despite the limited contents of his nearly empty refrigerator. She'd apparently found his emergency coffee stash, the cheap instant kind he'd been saving for desperate mornings, and had made a pot. Her hair was still damp but no longer dripping, and in the morning light streaming through the window, Marcus could see her more clearly than he had the night before. She was young, probably mid-20s, with an air of sophistication that was impossible to hide, even in her still damp clothing. But more than that, there was something haunted in her eyes, a shadow that spoke of pain Marcus recognized all too well. "I hope you don't mind," Sophie said, noticing him in the doorway. "I found some eggs in your refrigerator, and some bread. I wanted to make breakfast as a thank you." Marcus should have been angry that she'd gone through his kitchen without permission. Instead, he felt embarrassed that she'd seen how little food they had. The 3 eggs she'd found had been meant to stretch across several days. "You didn't have to do that," Marcus said, his voice rough with sleep and discomfort. "I said you could stay the night. That didn't mean you needed to cook." "I wanted to," Sophie replied, and there was something vulnerable in her voice. "It's been a long time since I did something normal like cook breakfast for someone. Everything in my life has been so—" She trailed off, but Marcus heard the words she didn't say. "So controlled, so artificial, so empty. Who are you really?" Marcus asked bluntly, crossing his arms. "Because I've been thinking all night, and your story doesn't add up. Nice girls from nice places don't end up lost in neighborhoods like mine at midnight during a storm." Sophie's hand trembled slightly as she flipped the eggs. For a moment, Marcus thought she might lie to him, might offer another vague explanation that raised more questions than answers. "You're right," she said finally, turning off the stove and facing him. "I wasn't completely honest with you. My name really is Sophie, but I didn't just get lost. I ran away. From my father. Why? Because he was trying to control every aspect of my life. Because he decided who I should marry, what I should do, how I should live. Because I realized that in his world, I wasn't a person. I was a possession, a bargaining chip, a trophy to be displayed." The pain in her voice was genuine. Marcus could hear that much. But there was still something she wasn't telling him. "What does your father do?" Marcus pressed. Sophie hesitated again, and in that hesitation, Marcus saw fear. Not fear of him, but fear of what would happen if she told the truth. Before she could answer, Emma appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Daddy? Who's cooking?" The tension in the kitchen immediately dissipated as Emma's presence reminded both adults that there were bigger concerns than uncomfortable truths. Sophie smiled at Emma, and Marcus noticed how the smile transformed her face, making her look younger and more genuine. "I made breakfast," Sophie told Emma. "I hope you're hungry." Emma looked at Marcus for permission, and when he nodded, she climbed into her chair with the enthusiasm only a 7-year-old could muster before breakfast. As they ate together, Marcus couldn't help but notice how naturally Sophie interacted with Emma. She asked questions about school, about Emma's favorite subjects, about the worn stuffed rabbit that Emma carried everywhere. She listened with genuine interest, not the patronizing attention adults often gave children. "My mommy died," Emma announced suddenly, with the blunt honesty of childhood. "Daddy says she's an angel now." Sophie's expression shifted to something softer, sadder. "I'm sorry, Emma. That must have been very hard." "It was," Emma agreed seriously. But Daddy takes good care of me. He works really hard. Sometimes he works so much he forgets to eat, but he always makes sure I have dinner. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He hadn't realized Emma noticed how often he skipped meals to make sure she had enough. "Your daddy sounds like a very good man," Sophie said. And when she looked at Marcus, there was respect in her eyes that he wasn't used to seeing from people who came from her world, whatever world that was. After breakfast, Marcus knew he needed to address the elephant in the room. "Sophie, you need to call your father. Whatever problems you have with him, he's probably worried sick about you." Sophie's face hardened. "You don't know my father. Trust me, the only thing he's worried about is how my disappearance affects his business deals and his reputation." "That's not fair," Marcus argued. "I'm a father too. If Emma disappeared, I would lose my mind. No matter what issues you have with him, you can't just vanish without a word." "He's not like you," Sophie said, her voice rising with frustration. "You don't understand what it's like to grow up with someone who sees you as a commodity instead of a daughter, who arranges your engagement to a man you barely know because it's good for business, who tells you that your dreams and wishes don't matter because he knows what's best for you." Marcus was about to respond when there was a sharp knock at the door. Not the desperate pounding from the night before, but the authoritative knock of someone who expected to be answered immediately. Marcus and Sophie exchanged glances. She looked terrified. "Did you tell anyone you were here?" Marcus whispered urgently. "No one," Sophie whispered back. "I swear." Marcus moved to the door cautiously and opened it to find two men in expensive suits standing on his doorstep. Behind them, parked on the street, was a black luxury car that looked more expensive than every vehicle on the block combined. "Marcus Williams?" one of the men asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Who's asking?" "My name is James. I'm the head of security for the Hartwell family." "We have reason to believe Sophie Hartwell is in this house." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Hartwell. As in Richard Hartwell, the billionaire whose name was synonymous with luxury real estate developments across the state. As in the Richard Hartwell who'd been on every news channel for the past week because his daughter had disappeared days before her arranged wedding to the son of another wealthy family. The girl in his kitchen, the stranger he'd shown compassion to, was the runaway heiress the entire state had been searching for. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "Mr. Williams, I understand you're trying to protect her," James said, his tone professional but firm. "But Miss Hartwell's father is extremely worried. He just wants to know she's safe." "And then what?" Sophie's voice came from behind Marcus. She'd appeared in the hallway, her chin lifted defiantly despite the fear in her eyes. "He drags me back home and forces me to marry Jonathan Sterling like a piece of property being transferred." "Miss Hartwell, your father has been frantic," James replied. "Whatever disagreements you have with him, disappearing like this was dangerous and irresponsible." "Irresponsible?" Sophie's voice rose. "What's irresponsible is arranging your daughter's life like she's a business deal. What's dangerous is forcing someone into a marriage they don't want." Marcus stood frozen between them, his mind racing. This was so far beyond anything he'd anticipated when he opened his door last night. He'd thought he was helping a stranger in need. Instead, he'd gotten caught in the middle of a family drama involving people with more money and power than he could imagine. "Sophie," Marcus said quietly, "maybe you should go with them. We can figure this out properly." Sophie turned to him, betrayal flashing in her eyes. "You too? You're going to side with them?" "I'm not siding with anyone," Marcus replied, feeling defensive. "But I have a daughter to protect. I can't afford to get involved in whatever this is." "Of course," Sophie said bitterly. "Everyone has their price, right? Everyone can be bought or intimidated." "That's not fair," Marcus shot back. "You lied to me. You didn't tell me who you were or what kind of situation I was getting involved in by helping you." "Would you have helped me if you'd known?" Sophie challenged. "Would you have opened that door if you'd known I was Richard Hartwell's daughter?" The question hung in the air, and Marcus realized he didn't know the answer. Would he have? Or would he have turned away the billionaire's daughter, assuming she had plenty of resources and didn't need help from someone like him? Before anyone could respond, Emma appeared in the hallway, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Why is everyone yelling?" she asked in a small voice. The sight of Emma immediately changed the atmosphere. Sophie's expression softened, and even the security guards looked uncomfortable. "It's okay, sweetheart," Marcus said, kneeling down to Emma's level. These men came to take Sophie home to her father. But she doesn't want to go, Emma observed with childlike clarity. I can see it in her face, like when Tommy at school has to go home to his mean stepdad. The comparison was innocent, but devastating. Marcus saw Sophie's eyes fill with tears, saw the security guards exchange uncomfortable glances. Emma, it's not the same thing, Marcus tried to explain. Yes, it is, Emma insisted with the stubborn certainty of childhood. Sometimes grown-ups make kids do things they don't want to do because they think they know better. But sometimes grown-ups are wrong. Out of the mouths of children came the truth that adults tried so hard to complicate. Marcus looked at Sophie, really looked at her, and saw not a privileged heiress, but a frightened young woman who'd been desperate enough to walk miles through a storm to escape her life. Give us a minute, Marcus said to the security guards. Mr. Williams, we really need to. I said give us a minute, Marcus repeated, his voice taking on an edge he rarely used. She's not going anywhere. I just need to talk to her. James hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes, but Mr. Hartwell is on his way here now. He'll want to speak with his daughter personally. When Marcus closed the door, he turned to Sophie. Is what you told me true? About the arranged marriage? Every word, Sophie said. My father made a deal with Jonathan Sterling's father years ago. Our marriage is supposed to merge their real estate empire with my father's. It's been planned since I was 18. I'm not a daughter to him. I'm a business strategy. And this Jonathan, is he? Marcus couldn't finish the question in front of Emma. He's not violent, Sophie said quickly. But he's cold, controlling. He sees me the same way my father does, as an asset. We've barely spoken more than a dozen words to each other, but we're supposed to spend the rest of our lives together. Marcus ran his hand through his hair, overwhelmed. This was so far beyond his understanding of the world. In his life, people married for love, or at least for genuine affection. The idea of arranged marriages in modern America seemed like something from another century. What do you want to happen here, Sophie? Marcus asked. Because in about 5 minutes, your father is going to show up, and I need to know what you expect from me. I don't expect anything, Sophie said quietly. You've already done more for me than almost anyone in my life. You saw a stranger in need and helped without asking for anything in return. Do you know how rare that is in my world? But what do you want? Marcus pressed. Sophie looked at Emma, then back at Marcus. I want what you have. A real connection with someone who cares about me as a person, not as a commodity. I want a matter for who I am, not what I'm worth. I want freedom to choose my own life. Before Marcus could respond, there was another knock at the door. This one was different, authoritative, but not aggressive. When Marcus opened it, he found himself face to face with a man whose face he'd seen 100 times on billboards and news broadcasts. Richard Hartwell stood on his doorstep, and nothing in Marcus's life had prepared him for this moment. The billionaire's eyes immediately found Sophie behind Marcus, and the expression that crossed his face was complex. Relief, anger, fear, and something that might have been love. Sophie, Richard said, his voice tight with emotion. Thank God you're safe. What happened next would test every assumption both men had about each other, expose truths about family and love that transcended wealth, and ultimately prove that the distance between a billionaire's mansion and a worker's humble home was nothing compared to the distance a father might travel to truly see his daughter. But in that moment, standing on opposite sides of a doorway, two fathers faced each other across a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Richard Hartwell stood in the doorway of Marcus Williams' humble home, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The billionaire's eyes were fixed on his daughter with an intensity that made Marcus instinctively step between them, a protective gesture he couldn't control. Mr. Williams, Richard said, his voice carefully controlled. I need to speak with my daughter. This doesn't concern you. Actually, it does, Marcus replied, surprising himself with his own boldness. She's in my home. That makes it my concern. Richard's jaw tightened. He was clearly a man unaccustomed to being contradicted, especially by someone from Marcus's economic circumstances. Behind him, James and the other security guard shifted uncomfortably. Daddy, don't, Sophie said, her voice breaking. Don't do this here. Don't make a scene in front of these people. These people? Richard's attention snapped back to his daughter. Sophie, you disappeared for days. You missed your engagement party. Do you have any idea what you put me through? What you've done to our family's reputation? Your reputation, Sophie shot back. That's all you care about, isn't it? Not that I was miserable, not that I was drowning, just how it looks to your business associates. Marcus felt Emma's small hand slip into his. She was scared, he could tell, but she was also watching the scene unfold with the sharp attention children give to adult conflicts they know are important but don't fully understand. "May I come inside?" Richard asked, and it took Marcus a moment to realize the question was directed at him, not Sophie. "Please, whatever you think of me, I just want to talk to my daughter." There was something in Richard's voice, beneath the authoritative tone and barely controlled anger, that sounded like pain. Marcus recognized it because he'd heard it in his own voice countless times since Sarah died. The sound of a parent terrified of losing their child. Against his better judgment, Marcus stepped aside. Richard entered the small house, and Marcus watched the billionaire's eyes take in everything. The water-stained walls, the worn furniture, the bucket still catching drips from the leaking ceiling. Marcus felt a familiar shame creeping up his neck, but he forced it down. He had nothing to be ashamed of. He worked hard. He loved his daughter, and he kept a roof over their heads. It might not be much, but it was honest. "Sophie," Richard began, but his daughter cut him off. "How did you find me?" Sophie demanded. "Your phone," James answered from the doorway. "It pinged a cell tower before it died. We've been searching this neighborhood all morning." "Of course," Sophie said bitterly. "You tracked me like a lost package." "Like a missing daughter," Richard corrected, his voice rising. "Sophie, you vanished without a word. I've had hundreds of people searching for you. I've barely slept. And for what? So you could hide in—" He stopped himself, but everyone in the room heard the unspoken end of that sentence. "So you could hide in this place, this poor place, this place beneath you." "Go ahead," Marcus said quietly. "Finish what you were going to say." Richard turned to Marcus, and for a moment, their eyes locked. Two fathers, separated by wealth, but connected by the fierce love they had for their children. "I apologize," Richard said stiffly. "That was inappropriate. I'm grateful you gave my daughter shelter, but this is a family matter." "Everything's a family matter with you," Sophie interjected. "Except you've never treated me like family. You've treated me like a business asset, like something to be managed and deployed strategically." "That's not fair," Richard said, and there was genuine hurt in his voice. "Everything I've done has been to protect you, to give you the best life possible." "The best life according to whom?" Sophie challenged. "You never asked what I wanted. You decided I would marry Jonathan Sterling when I was 18 years old. Did you ask me if I loved him? Did you care? Love?" Richard's voice took on a harder edge. "Sophie, love is a luxury. Security, stability, partnership. Those are what matter in the long term. Your mother and I didn't marry for love, and we built a good life together." The words hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Marcus saw Sophie's face go pale, saw tears spring to her eyes. "Mom settled for you," Sophie whispered. "Is that what you're saying? That she gave up on love and just accepted what was practical?" "Your mother understood reality," Richard said, but his voice wavered slightly. "She understood that feelings fade but commitment endures." "She was miserable," Sophie said, her voice breaking. "I remember Daddy. I remember how she looked at other couples, how she stared out windows like she was trapped, how she cried when she thought no one was watching." Richard flinched as if Sophie had struck him physically. "Your mother loved you," he said quietly. "I know she did," Sophie replied. "But did she love you? Did you ever give her a choice? Or did you arrange her life the same way you're trying to arrange mine?" Marcus felt like he was intruding on something deeply private, but he couldn't look away. He was watching a family unravel, watching years of buried pain surface all at once. "Mr. Hartwell," Marcus said quietly, "maybe you should sit down." Richard looked at Marcus like he'd forgotten anyone else was in the room. For a moment, Marcus thought the billionaire would refuse, would insist on his dignity. But then something in Richard's posture shifted, and he sank heavily into Marcus's threadbare armchair. "You have a daughter," Richard said, looking at Emma, who was still holding Marcus's hand. "You understand. You do everything you can to protect them, to give them opportunities, to shield them from making mistakes that could destroy their future." "I do understand," Marcus replied. "But there's a difference between protecting and controlling. Is there? Richard asked, and there was genuine confusion in his voice. Where's that line? How do you know when you're helping and when you're hurting? The vulnerability in the question surprised Marcus. This wasn't the arrogant billionaire he'd expected. This was a father who was lost, who genuinely didn't understand where he'd gone wrong. You ask them, Marcus said simply. You listen when they tell you they're hurting. You trust them to know what they need. And if what they think they need will ruin their life, Richard challenged, then you trust that you raise them well enough to learn from their own mistakes, Marcus responded. Mr. Hartwell, with all due respect, you can't protect your daughter from life. All you can do is be there when she needs you. That's easy for you to say, Richard replied, and there was an edge to his voice now. You don't know what it's like to have my responsibilities, to know that every decision affects thousands of people, that my daughter's choices have consequences beyond just her happiness. You're right, Marcus said. I don't know what it's like to be a billionaire, but I know what it's like to be a father, and I know that my daughter's happiness matters more than any business deal or social obligation. Because you have the luxury of simple choices, Richard shot back. Your daughter doesn't have corporations depending on her. She doesn't have legacies to uphold or empires to maintain. No, Marcus agreed. She just has me, and I just have her. And you know what? That's enough. We don't have much, but we have each other. Can you say the same? The question landed like a punch. Richard opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. In the silence that followed, everyone in the room could hear the truth he couldn't speak. Daddy, Sophie said softly, and something in her voice made everyone turn to look at her. Do you even know me? Do you know what I like, what I dream about, what scares me? Or do you only know me as the daughter of Richard Hartwell, the heir to your empire, the piece on your business chessboard? Of course I know you, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. What's my favorite book? Sophie asked. Richard hesitated. You always liked reading. What do I want to do with my life? What did I study in college? What makes me happy? Each question was met with silence, and with each silence, Marcus could see Richard Hartwell's carefully constructed world crumbling around him. I know I love you, Richard finally said, his voice breaking. I know I've worked my entire life to give you every opportunity. I know I've tried to protect you from every possible harm, but you never asked me what I wanted to be protected from, Sophie replied, tears streaming down her face now. You never asked if I wanted the life you planned for me. You just assumed that because it's what you would want, it's what I should want too. Emma tugged on Marcus's hand. Daddy, she whispered, why is everyone so sad? Marcus knelt down to Emma's level. Sometimes adults forget to talk to each other about important things. They assume they know what's best without asking. That's silly, Emma said with the blunt wisdom of childhood. In school, Mrs. Henderson says we should always ask before we assume. She says assuming makes problems. Out of the mouths of children. Marcus looked up to see both Richard and Sophie watching Emma, and something in their expressions had shifted. Your daughter is right, Richard said quietly. I assumed I knew what was best. I assumed you would understand my intentions. I assumed wrong. It was an admission that seemed to cost him everything. Richard Hartwell, the man who commanded boardrooms and built empires, was acknowledging failure in the most fundamental role of his life. Mr. Hartwell, Marcus said carefully, Sophie doesn't want to go back to that life. Can you understand that? What I understand, Richard said, his voice taking on a harder edge again, is that my daughter has obligations. A wedding has been planned. Contracts have been signed. Jonathan Sterling and his family are expecting what? Sophie interrupted. Expecting their purchased bride to show up on schedule, expecting me to smile and pretend I'm happy while I'm sold off like property? That's not what this is, Richard insisted. Jonathan is a good man from a good family. The merger between our companies will create opportunities. For everyone except me, Sophie finished. Daddy, can you even hear yourself? You're talking about business opportunities while planning my entire life without my consent. You consented when you got engaged, Richard pointed out. I was 18 years old, Sophie cried. I was scared of disappointing you. I thought if I just went along with it, eventually I'd feel differently. But I don't. I don't love Jonathan. I don't even like him. And I can't spend the rest of my life pretending. The front door burst open without warning, making everyone jump. A young man in expensive clothing strode in without invitation, his face flushed with anger and entitlement. "Found you?" Jonathan Sterling said. His eyes locked on Sophie with an intensity that made Marcus immediately step protectively in front of Emma. "Jonathan," Richard stood quickly. "How did you—" "I've been following your security team," Jonathan interrupted. "Did you really think I'd just sit home while my fiancée was missing? While our wedding becomes a joke in every business circle in the state?" Marcus watched Jonathan Sterling and immediately understood why Sophie had run. There was something cold in the young man's eyes, something that spoke of ownership rather than love. "Jonathan, this isn't the time," Richard began, but Jonathan ignored him completely. "Sophie, we're leaving. Now," Jonathan said, reaching for her arm. Marcus moved before thinking, positioning himself between Jonathan and Sophie. "No one's grabbing anyone in my house," he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. Jonathan looked at Marcus like he was noticing him for the first time. "Who are you supposed to be? The knight in shining armor? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" "A man who doesn't understand that no means no," Marcus replied evenly. For a moment, Marcus thought Jonathan might actually try to push past him. The younger man's hands clenched into fists, and his face flushed even darker with rage. "Jonathan," Richard's voice cut through the tension. "Control yourself. This is neither the time nor the place." "The time and place?" Jonathan turned his anger on Richard. "Your daughter humiliated me. She humiliated my entire family. Our wedding is supposed to be in 2 weeks, and she's been hiding in—" He looked around the shabby house with obvious disgust. "Here? With these people? These people gave me shelter when I needed it," Sophie said, finding her voice. "They showed me more kindness in one night than you've shown me in 3 years of being engaged." "Kindness," Jonathan laughed bitterly. "Is that what you think this is? Sophie, grow up. This man helped you because he saw an opportunity. Everyone wants something from people like us." "That's not true." Emma's small voice cut through the adult argument. Everyone turned to look at the little girl who'd been quiet throughout most of the confrontation. "My daddy helped Sophie because she was scared and cold and needed help," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. "He didn't know she was rich. He didn't know anything except that someone needed help. That's what good people do." The simplicity and truth of Emma's words created a moment of perfect silence. Jonathan looked at the child with something like confusion, as if he'd never encountered such basic human goodness and didn't know how to categorize it. "Sophie," Jonathan said, his voice attempting something that might have been meant as gentle, but came out patronizing. "You've had your adventure. You've made your point. But this childishness needs to end. We have responsibilities." "I have responsibilities to myself," Sophie replied. "To live a life that's mine, not one that's been sold to the highest bidder." "Your father and I have built something important together," Jonathan said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "This merger will create the largest real estate development company in the region. Hundreds of jobs depend on it. Billions of dollars are at stake." "And my happiness?" Sophie asked. "What's that worth in your calculations?" "Happiness is a choice," Jonathan said coldly. "You choose to be happy with what you have. You choose to see the opportunity instead of the sacrifice." Marcus had heard enough. "I think it's time for you to leave," he said to Jonathan. "Excuse me?" Jonathan looked at Marcus like he'd lost his mind. "This is my home," Marcus said firmly, "and I'm asking you to leave. Whatever issues you have with Sophie can be discussed somewhere else." "This is absurd," Jonathan turned to Richard. "Are you going to let this person tell me what to do?" Richard Hartwell looked at his daughter, then at Marcus and Emma, then at Jonathan Sterling. Something in his expression was shifting. Marcus could see it. Years of assumptions were being challenged. Certainties were crumbling. "Jonathan," Richard said slowly, "perhaps it would be best if you went back to your hotel. Let me speak with Sophie privately." "Privately?" Jonathan's voice rose. "Richard, we're partners. My family has invested billions in this merger, based on the promise of our children's union. You can't just—" "I can do whatever I want," Richard interrupted, and there was steel in his voice now. "And right now, I want to talk to my daughter without you here." Jonathan stared at Richard in disbelief, then at Sophie, then at Marcus. "Fine," he said coldly. "But this isn't over. We have contracts, legal obligations. You can't just walk away from this, Sophie. Watch me, Sophie replied. As Jonathan stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him, the tension in the room didn't dissipate. If anything, it intensified, because now Richard and Sophie were face to face with nothing between them except years of misunderstanding and pain. Daddy, Sophie said softly, did you see him? Did you see the man you want me to spend my life with? Richard was silent for a long moment. I saw a young man who's worried about his investment, he said finally. Not about me, Sophie pointed out. About his investment. Richard closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, Marcus saw something that looked like defeat. Or perhaps it was understanding. Sometimes they look the same. What do you want me to do, Sophie? Richard asked, and his voice was tired. Tell me what you want. I want you to call off the wedding, Sophie said. I want you to see me as your daughter, not as a business strategy. I want you to ask what I want instead of telling me what I should want. And what do you want? Richard asked. Sophie looked around the small, shabby house at Marcus and Emma, at the evidence of a life lived with far less money, but perhaps far more love than she'd ever known. I want to matter for who I am, not what I'm worth, she said finally. I want to choose my own life. I want freedom. Richard looked at Marcus. Did you put these ideas in her head? No, Marcus replied honestly. But if I had a daughter who felt trapped, I hoped someone would give her shelter until she could find her own strength. The two men stared at each other, and in that moment, something passed between them. Not friendship, not understanding, but perhaps the beginning of respect. I need time to think, Richard said finally. Sophie, please, come back home. Not to the wedding, not to Jonathan. Just home. Let's talk about this properly. Will you actually listen? Sophie asked. Or will you just try to convince me I'm wrong? I'll try to listen, Richard said, and there was something raw in his voice. I can't promise I'll understand, but I'll try. It wasn't everything Sophie needed, but it was more than she'd expected. Marcus could see her wavering, torn between hope and fear. Maybe you should go, Marcus said gently to Sophie. Talk to your father. Really talk to him. But what if, Sophie began. If you need somewhere to go again, you know where I live, Marcus assured her. As Sophie gathered her things, Emma approached Richard Hartwell. The billionaire looked down at the little girl with obvious uncertainty. My mommy died too, Emma said simply. Daddy said it's okay to be sad, but you have to tell people when you're sad, otherwise they can't help. Richard knelt down to Emma's level, this powerful man humbling himself before a child's wisdom. Thank you, he said softly. You're a very smart little girl. I know, Emma replied with the confidence of childhood. But you should tell Sophie that. I think she needs to hear that you notice things about her. Richard looked up at Sophie, and Marcus saw tears in the billionaire's eyes. You've always been smart, Richard said to his daughter. Even when you were Emma's age, you asked questions that made professors uncomfortable. I was always proud of you. It was a small thing, this acknowledgement, but Marcus saw how Sophie's face transformed. Sometimes the smallest admissions carry the most weight. As Richard and Sophie prepared to leave, Richard turned to Marcus one final time. I misjudged you, he said. You're a good man, Mr. Williams. Thank you for protecting my daughter. I didn't do it for thanks, Marcus replied. I did it because it was right. That's what makes you better than most people I know, Richard said quietly. After they left, Marcus stood in his doorway watching the expensive car drive away, knowing that nothing would be the same. He'd crossed an invisible line between worlds, and there would be consequences he couldn't yet anticipate. Daddy, Emma said, tugging his hand. Did we help? I think we did, sweetheart, Marcus replied. I think we did. But as he closed the door and looked around his small, humble home, Marcus wondered what price he would pay for showing compassion to someone from a world so different from his own. The answer would come sooner than he expected, and it would test everything he believed about justice, mercy, and the true cost of standing up for what's right. Days passed, and Marcus tried to return to his normal routine, but normal had become impossible. The encounter with Richard Hartwell and Sophie had opened a door that couldn't be closed, had shown him a glimpse of a world so vastly different from his own that it made his daily struggles feel simultaneously more crushing and more meaningful. He was exhausted as he walked into the Riverside manufacturing plant for his morning shift, his body still aching from the double shifts he'd been pulling to make up for the time he'd lost during Sophie's brief stay. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting their harsh glow on the rows of machinery that had been his daily landscape for the past 8 years. "Williams," his supervisor Dale Morrison called out before Marcus could even reach his station. "Need to see you in my office." The tone made Marcus's stomach drop. Dale had always been fair but firm, never one for small talk or unnecessary meetings. Being called to the office usually meant one thing: trouble. Marcus followed Dale through the factory floor, feeling the eyes of his co-workers tracking his movement. He'd worked alongside most of these men for years, shared breaks and complaints, celebrated births and mourned losses. They were good people, hard-working people who understood struggle because they lived it every day. Dale's office was barely more than a closet with a desk and 2 chairs, the walls covered in safety notices and production schedules. Dale closed the door and gestured for Marcus to sit, his expression unreadable. "Marcus, I'm going to be straight with you," Dale began, his hands folded on the desk. "I got a call from upper management. They got a complaint about you." "A complaint?" Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate. "About what?" "About you being involved in some kind of situation with Richard Hartwell's daughter. About you sheltering her when she was reported missing. About you interfering in family matters that weren't your concern." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. "I didn't interfere in anything. A girl showed up at my door during a storm asking for help. I gave her shelter for 1 night. That's it." "That's not how it's being portrayed," Dale said, and there was sympathy in his voice now. "The company got contacted by someone from the Sterling family's legal team. They're suggesting that you might have had inappropriate motives for helping the Hartwell girl." "Inappropriate motives?" Marcus felt rage building in his chest. "I have a 7-year-old daughter at home. I helped a stranger in need. There was nothing inappropriate about it." "I believe you," Dale said quickly. "But Marcus, you have to understand the position this puts the company in. Richard Hartwell owns 3 of our largest client accounts. If his future son-in-law's family is making accusations, the higher-ups are going to protect their business interests." "So, what are you saying?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "I'm saying you're being put on unpaid leave pending an investigation." "It's not my decision, Marcus. It's coming from the top." The room seemed to tilt. Unpaid leave, which meant no paycheck, which meant he couldn't pay rent, couldn't buy food, couldn't keep Emma in school supplies. His entire fragile existence was balanced on the edge of financial collapse, and one act of kindness had just pushed him over. "How long?" Marcus asked, his voice hollow. "They didn't say. Could be a few days, could be longer." "I'm sorry, Marcus. This isn't right, but my hands are tied." Marcus stood up mechanically, his mind racing through the implications. He had maybe $300 in savings, enough for perhaps 2 weeks if he was incredibly careful. After that, "Dale, I need this job," Marcus said, hating the desperation in his own voice. "Emma needs me to have this job." "I know," Dale replied, and he genuinely looked pained. "And for what it's worth, everyone here knows you're a good man. But sometimes good men get caught in situations they can't control." As Marcus walked out of the factory, still wearing his work uniform because he hadn't even made it to his station, he felt a familiar rage building. The same rage he'd felt when Sarah died, and he'd discovered their insurance wouldn't cover her medical bills. The same rage he'd felt every time he'd had to choose between paying electricity or buying Emma new shoes. The rage of a man who worked hard, played by the rules, and still couldn't catch a break. He arrived home to find Emma being watched by Mrs. Chen from next door, an elderly woman who helped out when Marcus had early shifts. Mrs. Chen took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. "Mr. Williams?" she asked in her heavily accented English. "You okay?" "I'm fine, Mrs. Chen," Marcus lied. "Thank you for watching Emma." After Mrs. Chen left, Emma looked up at her father with those 2 perceptive eyes. "Daddy, why are you home early? Are you sick?" "No, sweetheart," Marcus said, kneeling down to her level. "Just some problems at work. Nothing for you to worry about." "Is it because of Sophie?" Emma asked, and Marcus felt his heart sink. "Why would you think that?" "I heard Tommy's mom talking to Mrs. Rodriguez. She said you got in trouble for helping rich people." "Is that true?" Marcus closed his eyes, fighting back the wave of anger and frustration. Of course the neighborhood was talking. News traveled fast in communities like theirs, especially news that involved wealthy people and drama. Sometimes when you try to help people, other people don't understand, Marcus explained carefully. But that doesn't mean helping was wrong. I know, Emma said confidently. You always say doing the right thing isn't always easy. Before Marcus could respond, there was a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with someone he'd never expected to see again. Sophie. But this Sophie was different from the desperate, rain-soaked girl who'd appeared on his doorstep. This Sophie wore expensive clothing, had her hair styled professionally, and arrived in a car that Marcus recognized as the same one Richard Hartwell had left in. "Marcus," Sophie said, and her voice was tight with emotion. "I just heard what happened. I'm so sorry." "How did you hear?" Marcus asked, not moving aside to let her in. "My father told me. Jonathan's family contacted your employer. They're trying to punish you for helping me." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. "Punish me? Why?" "Because Jonathan is vindictive and petty," Sophie said, her hands clenching into fists. "Because he sees you as someone who helped me defy him, and he can't stand that. Because in his world, people like you don't say no to people like him. People like me," Marcus repeated flatly. "You mean poor people." "I didn't mean it like that," Sophie said quickly, but Marcus could see she knew how it sounded. "What do you want, Sophie?" Marcus asked, suddenly tired of all of it. "I want to fix this," Sophie replied. "I want to make sure you don't suffer because you helped me. My father is willing to—" "Stop," Marcus interrupted. "Your father is willing to what? Give me money? Buy off my employer? Use his influence to smooth things over? Would that be so bad?" Sophie challenged. "Marcus, you could lose everything because of me. Let us help." "I don't want your help," Marcus said, even as a voice in his head screamed that he was being an idiot, that he should take whatever assistance was offered. "I don't want your father's money or influence. I want to live my life without being caught between rich people playing their power games." "This isn't a game," Sophie said urgently. "Marcus, please, you have Emma to think about. Don't let pride—" "It's not pride," Marcus cut her off. "It's dignity. The second I take your father's money, I become just another person he can control. Just another piece on his chessboard." "That's not fair," Sophie protested. "My father genuinely wants to help. He feels terrible about what's happening to you." "Then tell him to call off his future son-in-law," Marcus replied. "Tell him to use his power to stop Jonathan from destroying my life instead of using his money to fix the damage after it's done." Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by Emma appearing in the doorway. "Sophie!" Emma's face lit up with genuine joy. "You came back!" Sophie's expression softened immediately. She knelt down to Emma's level, and Marcus saw tears forming in her eyes. "Hi, Emma. I wanted to check on you and your dad." "We're okay," Emma said with the resilient optimism of childhood. "Daddy says we always figure things out." "Your dad is a very good man," Sophie said, looking up at Marcus. "One of the best I've ever known." "I know," Emma agreed simply. "That's why people try to help us sometimes. Mrs. Patterson gives us food, and Mr. Rodriguez fixed our sink for free, and Mrs. Chen watches me when Daddy has to work. Good people help good people." The innocent wisdom of Emma's words hung in the air. Sophie stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "Let good people help good people," Sophie echoed softly. "Marcus, I'm not offering charity. I'm offering justice. You shouldn't have to suffer because you showed compassion." "Life isn't fair," Marcus replied. "I learned that a long time ago. But it could be," Sophie insisted. "If people with resources used them to help instead of hurt. If people with power used it to protect instead of punish. That's all I'm asking. Let my father do something good with his influence." Marcus wanted to refuse. Every proud, stubborn part of him wanted to send Sophie away and figure this out on his own like he always had. But then he looked at Emma, thought about the rent due in a week, thought about the dwindling food in their refrigerator, and felt his resolve cracking. "What exactly is your father offering?" Marcus asked quietly. "He wants to meet with you," Sophie replied. "To apologize properly and discuss how he can make this right. No strings attached. Just one father to another." The phrasing struck Marcus. One father to another. Maybe that was the common ground they could find. Not in wealth or status, but in the shared experience of trying to protect their daughters. When? Marcus asked. Now, Sophie said. He's waiting in the car. He didn't want to presume you'd agree to see him, so he stayed outside. Marcus looked down at Emma, then back at Sophie. Give me a minute. He called Mrs. Chen to come back over to watch Emma, promising to explain everything later. As he put on his one good shirt, the one he wore to parent-teacher conferences and Emma's school events, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. He looked tired, worn down by years of struggle that showed in every line of his face. But he also saw something else. Dignity. He might be poor, might be desperate, but he wasn't broken. Not yet. Sophie led him to the car where Richard Hartwell sat in the back seat. When Marcus slid in beside him, the billionaire looked almost as uncomfortable as Marcus felt. Mr. Williams, Richard began, thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I'm here for my daughter, Marcus said bluntly. Not for you. Fair enough, Richard replied. I'll be equally direct. What Jonathan Sterling's family is doing to you is unconscionable. They're weaponizing their influence to punish you for showing basic human decency. Can you stop them? Marcus asked. Richard was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said finally. But it would mean ending my business relationship with the Sterling family completely. It would mean calling off Sophie's wedding publicly. It would mean choosing my daughter's happiness over billions of dollars in business agreements. The weight of that statement settled over the car. Marcus understood what Richard was really asking. Was Marcus's life worth that much sacrifice? I see, Marcus said quietly. But I'm going to do it anyway, Richard continued, and there was steel in his voice now. Because my daughter was right. I've spent so long viewing people as assets and liabilities that I forgot they're human beings. You showed me something I'd forgotten. That compassion has value beyond monetary calculation. Marcus didn't know what to say. He'd expected offers of money, legal protection maybe, but not this. Not the billionaire actually choosing principle over profit. There's more, Richard said. I've been investigating Jonathan Sterling since Sophie ran away. Really investigating. Not just accepting the reputation his family bought. He's not a good man, Marcus. He has a history of being controlling, aggressive with past girlfriends. My daughter would have been miserable with him. Probably worse than miserable. Why are you telling me this? Marcus asked. Because you deserve to know that your act of kindness didn't just save Sophie from one difficult night. It possibly saved her from years of misery or worse. And because, Richard paused, seeming to struggle with the words. Because I need you to understand that I'm trying to change, that I'm trying to be better. The driver pulled up to an upscale restaurant that Marcus had walked past 1,000 times, but never imagined entering. When Richard opened the door, Marcus hesitated. I can't afford this place, Marcus said bluntly. You're my guest, Richard replied. Please, just hear me out. Inside the restaurant, Marcus felt every eye turned toward them. His worn work uniform stood in stark contrast to the expensive suits and designer clothing around him. He felt like an imposter, like at any moment someone would realize he didn't belong and throw him out. But Richard walked with him as an equal, chose a private table, and spoke to him with a respect that Marcus hadn't expected. I want to offer you a position in my company, Richard said once they were seated. Director of Community Relations. It would pay 4 times what you make at the factory, include full benefits, and give you regular hours so you can be home with Emma. Marcus stared at him. Why? Because you see people I've been blind to, Richard explained. Because you understand struggles that I've never faced. Because my company needs someone who actually cares about community impact instead of just profit margins. I don't have any qualifications for that kind of job, Marcus protested. You have the most important qualification, Richard replied. You're a good man who does the right thing even when it costs you. That's rarer and more valuable than any business degree. Marcus wanted to refuse on principle, wanted to maintain his independence and dignity. But he thought about Emma, about the leaking roof he couldn't afford to fix, about the security this job would provide. I need time to think, Marcus said. Of course, Richard agreed. But Marcus, regardless of your decision, I'm handling the situation with Jonathan. You won't lose your current job. That's not conditional on you accepting my offer. It was the assurance Marcus needed to hear. This wasn't a bribe or manipulation. It was a genuine offer from one father to another. As they talked through the meal, Marcus found himself seeing Richard Hartwell not as a billionaire, but as a flawed human being trying to be better. They spoke about daughters, about loss. Richard's wife had died years ago, leaving him alone to raise Sophie, and about the terrifying responsibility of parenthood. Every decision feels impossible, Richard admitted. How do you know if you're protecting them or controlling them? How do you know when to hold on and when to let go? You don't, Marcus replied honestly. You just do your best and hope it's enough. And when you realize you've made a mistake, you admit it and try to fix it. Richard looked at Marcus with something that might have been envy. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, Marcus said, but it's honest. That's all we can really give our kids, honesty about who we are and what we value. When Marcus returned home hours later, his head was spinning with possibilities. Emma was already asleep, but Mrs. Chen was waiting to hear about the meeting. Whatever they offered you, Mrs. Chen said in her broken English, you think hard. Sometimes pride is expensive luxury we can't afford. She was right, Marcus knew. But accepting help from Richard Hartwell meant crossing a line he'd never imagined crossing. It meant joining a world he'd always viewed from the outside. As he lay in bed that night, Marcus thought about Sophie, about Richard, about the strange twist of fate that had brought them into his life. He thought about Emma and the opportunities this job could provide for her. And he thought about his own father, a man who'd worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and died of a heart attack at 52, worn out from decades of struggle. Would his father see this as selling out or as being smart, as compromise or as wisdom? Marcus didn't know, but he knew he had a decision to make that would change everything. In another part of the city, Sophie sat with her father in their mansion, having the first real conversation they'd had in years. Richard admitted his failures as a father. Sophie admitted her fears about disappointing him, and slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild trust that had been crumbling for years. And somewhere else, Jonathan Sterling was planning his revenge, determined to destroy the man who dared to interfere in his plans. The collision was inevitable. The only question was who would survive it. Marcus spent 2 sleepless nights wrestling with Richard Hartwell's offer before making his decision. On the 3rd morning, he woke up knowing what he had to do, though the choice still felt impossible. He called Richard from the payphone outside the corner store, unable to afford the minutes on his cell phone. I'll take the job, Marcus said simply, but I have conditions. Name them, Richard replied without hesitation. I want to finish out my notice at the factory properly. I don't abandon my co-workers without warning, and I want it clear to everyone that this isn't charity. I'll be earning my position. Agreed, Richard said, and Marcus heard respect in his voice. Though you should know, your current employer already reinstated you. I had a conversation with their board of directors about the situation. You can return to work tomorrow if you'd like. Marcus felt a weight lift from his chest. Thank you, but I'll still be giving proper notice. 2 weeks. You're a better man than most people I know, Marcus Williams, Richard said quietly. I'll have the employment contracts sent over. We'll start your orientation after your notice period ends. After hanging up, Marcus stood outside the store, watching his neighborhood wake up. Mrs. Rodriguez opening her small grocery store, Mr. Chen sweeping the sidewalk in front of his restaurant, children heading to the bus stop for school. This had been his world for so long, and now he was about to step into something completely different. You look like you've seen a ghost, a voice said behind him. Marcus turned to find Dale Morrison, his supervisor from the factory. Dale looked uncomfortable, guilty even. Marcus, I heard you got reinstated. I'm glad. What happened to you wasn't right. It's okay, Dale, Marcus said. You were just doing your job. No, it's not okay, Dale insisted. I've been thinking a lot about it, about how easily we throw good people under the bus when powerful people push. I should have fought harder for you. You would have lost your job too, Marcus pointed out. Maybe, Dale agreed. But at least I would have been able to look at myself in the mirror. Listen, Marcus, I heard rumors that you got a job offer from Hartwell Enterprises. Is it true? It's true, Marcus confirmed. I'm giving my 2 weeks' notice when I come back tomorrow. Dale nodded slowly. Good for you. You deserve better than that factory. But Marcus, be careful. People like the Hartwells, they live in a different world. Sometimes, when regular people try to cross into that world, they get crushed. The warning stayed with Marcus as he returned home. But when he walked through his door and saw Emma doing her homework at their wobbly kitchen table, he knew he'd made the right choice. This wasn't about him crossing into another world. It was about giving his daughter opportunities she'd never have otherwise. Days passed, and Marcus returned to the factory to work out his notice. His co-workers were supportive, though some seemed uncomfortable around him now, as if his association with the Hartwell family had created an invisible barrier between them. "You're not one of us anymore," Tommy Davidson said during lunch break, not unkindly, but stating what he saw as fact. "You're moving up, Marcus. That's good, but it changes things." Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to insist he'd always be one of them, but he recognized the truth in Tommy's words. He was leaving their shared struggle behind, and that created distance no amount of goodwill could completely bridge. On his final day at the factory, his co-workers threw him a small party during lunch break. They'd pooled their money to buy him a new shirt for his first day at his new job, and Marcus found himself fighting back tears at their generosity. "You show them how it's done," Rodriguez said, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. "You show those rich people what real character looks like." That evening, Marcus took Emma out for ice cream at the small shop near their house, a rare treat they could barely afford, but that felt necessary to mark this transition. "Daddy," Emma said as she worked on her cone, "are we going to be rich now?" The question was so innocent, so hopeful, that Marcus felt his heart clench. "No, sweetheart," Marcus said gently. "We're going to have more money than we did before, which means things will be easier. But we're not going to be rich like Sophie's family, and that's okay. We'll still be us." "Good," Emma said seriously. "I like being us." As they walked home in the evening light, Marcus felt a sense of peace settling over him. Yes, things were changing. Yes, he was nervous about his new job. But he was moving forward, providing better for Emma, and that was what mattered. The peace lasted exactly 12 hours. The next morning, Marcus was woken by pounding on his door. When he opened it, he found 2 police officers standing on his doorstep, their expressions professionally neutral. "Marcus Williams?" one of them asked. "Yes," Marcus replied, his heart immediately racing. "What's wrong? Is Emma okay?" "Your daughter is fine," the officer assured him. "But we need you to come down to the station. There's been an accusation made against you." "An accusation?" Marcus felt the world tilting. "What kind of accusation?" "Mr. Jonathan Sterling has filed a complaint alleging that you've been harassing him and making threats. He has documentation of phone calls and messages that he claims came from you." Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "That's impossible. I've never contacted Jonathan Sterling. I don't even have his phone number." "That's what we need to sort out at the station," the officer said. "We're not arresting you, just asking you to come answer some questions." As Marcus was led to the police car, he saw Mrs. Chen watching from her window, her face filled with concern. He saw neighbors starting to emerge, drawn by the commotion. He saw Emma's face pressed against their window, her eyes wide with fear. At the police station, Marcus was placed in an interrogation room that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. The officers showed him printed copies of text messages and call logs, all allegedly from his phone number, all containing threatening language directed at Jonathan Sterling. "I didn't send these," Marcus insisted. "Someone must have spoofed my number or hacked my phone. I've never sent a threatening message to anyone in my life." "Mr. Williams, your phone records show these calls and messages originating from your device," the detective said. "Can you explain that?" "No," Marcus admitted. "But I'm telling you, I didn't send them. This is a setup." "A setup?" The detective's skepticism was obvious. "Why would someone want to frame you?" "Because Jonathan Sterling wants revenge for me helping his fiancée when she ran away from him. Because he wants to destroy my life for daring to interfere in his plans." Even as Marcus said the words, he knew how they sounded. Paranoid, defensive, like someone making excuses. The detective's expression confirmed it. Marcus was held for 6 hours while they investigated. During that time, all he could think about was Emma, scared and confused, wondering where her father was. Finally, his court-appointed lawyer arrived, a tired-looking woman named Angela Torres, who'd been assigned to his case. "Mr. Williams," Angela said, sitting across from him in the interrogation room, "I'm going to be honest with you. This doesn't look good. The evidence against you is compelling, and Jonathan Sterling is a wealthy, credible witness with no apparent motive to lie." "No apparent motive?" Marcus felt hysteria bubbling up. "He's trying to marry Richard Hartwell's daughter. I helped her run away. That's his motive." Angela made notes. "That's something we can explore. But Marcus, you need to understand, even if we prove you didn't send these messages, the process of proving it could destroy your life. Legal battles with people like the Sterlings can drag on for years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars." Marcus put his head in his hands. He'd thought accepting Richard's job offer would be the hard part, the big transition. He hadn't realized that Jonathan Sterling would come after him this viciously, this calculatingly. "I want to call Richard Hartwell," Marcus said. "Is he your lawyer?" Angela asked. "No, but he might be able to help. Mr. Williams, I'd advise against involving civilians in an active police investigation." "I don't care," Marcus interrupted. "Jonathan Sterling is doing this because of Richard's daughter. Richard needs to know." They let him make one phone call. Richard answered on the second ring. "Marcus, what's wrong?" "Jonathan Sterling is trying to destroy me," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "He's claiming I've been threatening him. The police have me at the station. Richard, I didn't do this. You have to believe me." There was a brief pause. Then Richard's voice came back cold and hard. "Don't say anything else to the police. I'm sending my lawyers immediately. Do you understand me? Nothing. Not another word until my legal team arrives." "Richard, I can't afford—" "You're not paying for them." Richard cut him off. "This is my fault. Jonathan is targeting you because of Sophie. I'll fix this." 90 minutes later, 3 attorneys from one of the most prestigious law firms in the state arrived at the police station. They were led by a formidable woman named Victoria Cross, who radiated competence and barely controlled fury. "Detective," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I'm representing Mr. Williams. I'd like to see all evidence against my client immediately." What followed was a masterclass in legal warfare that Marcus could barely follow. Victoria and her team dissected every piece of evidence, demanded access to Jonathan Sterling's devices, threatened lawsuits for false accusations, and generally made it clear that prosecuting Marcus Williams would be the most expensive mistake the police department ever made. Within 2 hours, the detectives' attitude had shifted from certainty to doubt. Within 3 hours, they'd discovered that the threatening messages had been sent using sophisticated spoofing technology that made them appear to come from Marcus's phone, but had actually originated from an IP address traced to a device registered to one of Jonathan Sterling's employees. "My client is being released immediately," Victoria announced, "and will be filing harassment charges against Mr. Sterling for false accusations and attempted criminal conspiracy." As Marcus walked out of the police station, he found Richard Hartwell waiting outside. Sophie stood beside him, her face streaked with tears. "Marcus, I'm so sorry," Sophie said immediately. "This is all my fault. Jonathan is doing this to punish you for helping me." "It's not your fault," Marcus said, though he felt numb. "It's Jonathan's fault. And honestly, right now I just want to see my daughter." "Of course," Richard said. "My driver will take you home. And Marcus, I want you to know, this ends now. Jonathan Sterling has gone too far." As they drove through the city, Marcus stared out the window at the world passing by. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. He'd been naive to think that one act of kindness wouldn't have consequences, that showing compassion to Sophie wouldn't make him a target. When he arrived home, Emma ran into his arms with such force that she nearly knocked him over. Mrs. Chen had stayed with her all day, keeping her calm despite the fear. "Daddy, I was so scared," Emma sobbed into his shoulder. "The police took you away." "I know, baby," Marcus whispered, holding her tight. "But I'm home now. Everything's okay." But it wasn't okay, and Emma was too smart not to know it. That night, after she finally fell asleep, Marcus sat in their tiny living room and wondered if accepting Richard's help had been a terrible mistake. Maybe Dale had been right. Maybe trying to cross into the Hartwells' world would only get him crushed. His phone rang. It was Sophie. "Marcus, I need to tell you something," she said without preamble. "I'm calling off the wedding publicly tomorrow. I'm going to hold a press conference and tell everyone the truth about Jonathan, about the arranged marriage, about everything." "Sophie, you don't have to do that," Marcus said. "Yes, I do," Sophie replied firmly. "Jonathan went after you because he thought he could intimidate me through you. He thought if he hurt you, I'd fall back in line. He was wrong. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what kind of man he really is. That will destroy your family's business relationship with the Sterlings, Marcus pointed out. I know, Sophie said, and my father knows too. He's the one who suggested the press conference. He said, and I quote, "Some principles are worth more than any amount of money." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Richard Hartwell, the billionaire who'd spent decades building his empire, was willing to risk it all to protect his daughter and stand up for what was right. "Tell your father thank you," Marcus said quietly, "for everything." "You can tell him yourself," Sophie replied. "He wants to meet with you tomorrow before the press conference. He has something important to discuss." The next morning, Marcus arrived at Hartwell Enterprises headquarters for the first time. The building was everything he'd imagined, glass and steel reaching toward the sky. A monument to success and power that felt worlds away from the factory floor he'd left behind. Richard met him in his office, which occupied the entire top floor with views that stretched across the entire city. But Richard barely seemed to notice the luxury surrounding him. His attention was focused entirely on Marcus. "Marcus, I want you to be present at Sophie's press conference today," Richard said. "I want you standing beside us when she tells the truth about Jonathan Sterling." "Why?" Marcus asked. "This is your family's matter." "Because you're part of this story now," Richard replied. "Because your courage in helping Sophie when she needed it is going to be part of what exposes Jonathan for what he is. And because I want the world to see that sometimes the best people, the most honorable people, are the ones society overlooks." "Richard, I'm just a factory worker who opened his door during a storm," Marcus protested. "No," Richard said firmly. "You're a man who saw another human being in need and helped without asking what was in it for you. That's rarer than you think, and it's worth celebrating." At the press conference that afternoon, Sophie stood before dozens of cameras and reporters and told her truth. She spoke about the arranged marriage, about Jonathan's controlling behavior, about running away in desperation and finding kindness from a stranger who asked for nothing in return. She spoke about how Jonathan had tried to intimidate Marcus, had filed false accusations, had used his wealth and influence to destroy a good man's life simply because he dared to show compassion. "My father and I are ending all business relationships with the Sterling family," Sophie announced. "Because some principles matter more than profit. Because I refuse to be part of a system that rewards cruelty and punishes kindness." The press conference made national news. Within hours, Jonathan Sterling's reputation was in ruins. Other women came forward with stories of his controlling behavior, his vindictiveness, his sense of entitlement. The Sterling family's business empire took hit after hit as partners distanced themselves. But the real surprise came when Marcus's phone started ringing with interview requests, with people wanting to hear his story. Suddenly, the struggling single father who'd shown compassion to a stranger became a symbol of everyday heroism, of the quiet dignity of working people who do the right thing even when it costs them everything. "Daddy, you're on TV," Emma said, pointing at the screen where Marcus's story was being discussed on the evening news. Marcus watched himself being described as a hero and felt uncomfortable with the label. He wasn't a hero. He'd just been a decent human being. But he was beginning to understand that in a world where cruelty was often rewarded and compassion punished, maybe decent humanity was heroic. That evening, Richard called. "Marcus, I have news. Several major corporations saw Sophie's press conference. 3 of them have reached out wanting to partner with Hartwell Enterprises, specifically because of our stance. It turns out that doing the right thing is actually good for business. Who knew?" Marcus heard the irony in Richard's voice and found himself smiling despite everything he'd been through. "Also," Richard continued, "I wanted you to know that your new position is still waiting for you. In fact, after today, I think it's more important than ever. We need people who understand what real values look like." As Marcus hung up the phone and looked around his small, shabby house, he realized that everything had changed, and nothing had changed. He was still the same person, with the same values, trying to do right by his daughter. The only difference was that now he had allies in that fight, people who'd learned to see beyond wealth and status to the human beings underneath. Emma crawled into his lap, her small body warm and trusting against his chest. "Daddy, I'm proud of you," she said simply. And in that moment, Marcus knew that no amount of money, no prestigious job title, Nothing in Richard Hartwell's entire empire was worth more than those 5 words from his daughter. The storm wasn't over. There would be legal battles ahead, adjustments to navigate, new challenges to face. But for the first time in years, Marcus felt like he wasn't fighting alone. And sometimes, that makes all the difference.